Good evening. I'm Catherine Epstein, Provost and Dean of the Faculty at Amherst College. Thank you for joining us for the second lecture in our series, The History of Anti-Black Racism in America. This series takes as its premise that in order to combat anti-Black racism, we need to know much more about the history of racism in the United States. We need to know about how the history of racism has shaped the economics and politics of our country, and in turn, its structures of housing, education, policing, and much else. Tonight, we are honored to have with us Martha Jones, Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Jones recently published Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. One of the arguments of this book is that its protagonists, Black women activists, believe that their struggle to win the vote for all women would advance humanity as a whole. And this was not a narrow, one-issue movement. Instead, when Black women struggled for rights, they struggled against many of the world's ills, from racism to poverty to colonialism. And just to drive the point home that they have strived to better the lot of all humanity, since Friday evening, we have mourned the loss of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We have recalled her amazing legacy in promoting equal rights for all human beings, regardless of their race, gender, sexual orientation, or other identity. But few have noted that among those who helped to shape RBG's thinking was Pauli Murray, one of the women featured in Martha Jones' Vanguard. Pauli Murray was a lawyer, professor, and social activist, and it was she who came up with the legal strategy that Ginsburg later employed to convince the Supreme Court to bar sex discrimination, that is, applying the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to gender. As Ginsburg has said of Pauli Murray and her colleagues' work, we owed them so much, for they kept the idea and the hope alive. And RGB further noted, we're standing on their shoulders. We're saying the same things they said, but now at least society is ready to listen. While showing the outsized influence of Black women's activism in the United States and beyond, Professor Jones also points to another significant feature of this movement, how Black activists remembered and celebrated each other. From generation to generation, they named their clubs and groups, and even their children after their foremothers, from Phyllis Wheatley to Fannie Lou Hamer. Most movingly, to me at least, is that in the introduction, Professor Jones talks about her own family history and the strong women who preceded her. As one of the enduring features of the Black women's movement for political rights, this culture of celebration and honoring is itself a strength and wonderful contribution of the movement. Honoring past contributions and achievements of those who were not recognized in their time is crucial to reminding all of us that individuals from every group can excel at all human endeavors, whether women in STEM fields or Black women in the field of jurisprudence. So thank you, Professor Jones, for joining us and sharing your work with us this evening. Now I'd like to briefly thank Professor Jen Mannion, Associate Professor of History, who in turn will do a formal introduction of Professor Jones. Jen Mannion came up with the idea for this series and then quickly turned the idea into action. This lecture series not only features the most distinguished historians of African American history today, as if that were not enough, but Jen has also organized a non-credit seminar around the lecture series. After each lecture, Jen facilitates hour-long discussions based on the lecture and some accompanying readings. I want to thank the 170 staff, faculty, and students who have signed up for the seminar. And I'd also particularly like to give a shout out to the over 50% of participants who are staff members at the college. I'm thrilled that so many of you are eager to engage with the history of anti-Black racism in America. You are committing time to reading and discussion in addition to watching the lectures. Meanwhile, Jen is spending many hours planning, organizing, and facilitating these discussion seminars. And of course, she's doing the conversations with our esteemed guests. So thank you, Jen, for that amazing work. Finally, before turning this over to Jen, I'd like to note that this lecture series is supported by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, to support the cultivation of public scholarship in the humanities at Amherst College. Jen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Provost Epstein. My name is Jen Mannion. I'm an associate professor of history here at Amherst College. It's my great honor to introduce to you Professor Martha S. Jones. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, and winner of many awards, including the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award for the best book in civil rights history, the American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize for the best book in American legal history, and the American Society for Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award for the best book in Anglo-American legal history. Professor Jones is also author of All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2007. I actually want to read one of the blurbs from that book because I feel like it gets at the heart of Dr. Jones's work. This blurb says of All Bound Up Together, this book is groundbreaking in its reconfiguration of Black women's rights as part and parcel of both the Black freedom struggle in the 19th century and the first wave of American feminism. It recasts both stories in critical ways and, more important, makes clear that they are deeply intertwined. This work is a tour de force. And that was from our dear friend Nancy Hewitt. But now, most recently, the newly released book on which tonight's talk is based, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Fought for Rights for All, published by Basic Books. Professor Jones is recognized as a public historian, frequently writing for broader audiences at outlets including the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time. She has curated museum exhibitions, including Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation in conjunction with the William Clements Library, and collaborated with the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, the American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, PBS, Netflix, and art. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law. Prior to the start of her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work as a Charles H. Revson Fellow on the future of the city of New York at Columbia University. Professor Jones currently serves as a president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. Every January, members of the American Historical Association meet for our annual meeting. This past gathering was in New York City, just 2 months before the spread of SARS-CoV-19 stopped life as we know it. Like many historians of women and gender in the US, I had been thinking about the significance of the upcoming centennial of the 19th Amendment, which was ratified on August 18, 1920. The amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." I wondered how this commemoration would be framed, what stories would be told, and what others would be overlooked. Flipping through the conference program, I came across a plenary entitled, "Looking Through the Glass Window, The Women Without the Vote 100 Years Ago," featuring a phenomenal group of historians, including tonight's guest, Dr. Martha Jones. It was exactly what I needed, both a reflection on the latest work in the field of women's history, centering women of color, and a reminder of the imperative that these stories not be lost or buried in the rush to celebrate the centennial. At this session and in her work more broadly, Dr. Jones interrogates the ambitions and efforts of both ordinary and extraordinary Black women, those who have long been neglected by history books. She's an active public intellectual committed to the power of history to help us understand and transform our world. I have long admired Dr. Jones's dedicated and skillful use of social media, especially Twitter, as a tool for teaching, community building, and transformation. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Martha Jones to Amherst College this evening.
Well, thank you. Thank you to everyone at Amherst College. It's an honor to be here. I really very much appreciate the extra effort to convene us under these circumstances. It's been so important, I think, for many of us to have the opportunity to see one another, to talk together, despite not being able to get on the plane and the train. So thank you so much for this series and for having me here. Thank you to Provost Epstein for a very generous and careful reading of Vanguard, and for presiding over this series. And of course, thank you to Professor Jen Mannion for including me and for remembering that not so long ago, but in the pre-times when we were together in New York to talk about some of these questions. My theme this evening is indeed the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, ratified in August of 1920. We are marking that amendment's centennial. And part of my work has been to help us move, if you will, in our thinking away from some of the myths that surround the amendment and closer to the important but complicated history that is where it really resides. The story of the amendment is, I think, indeed one facet of a national reckoning with the past, especially a reckoning with the role that racism has played in shaping the nation. And my hope tonight is that through this conversation and the many others of it, like it, that you all will have, there'll be an opportunity to better understand, for example, what happened in 1920 as a way of aiding us in moving forward. Now, if you mention to me that you're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, you might notice that I'm a little uncomfortable. So don't get me wrong. I finished a book, as Professor Mannion and Provost Epstein have mentioned, just finished a book on the history of Black women in the vote. And so I'm as interested as any of us in this anniversary and its significance. And still, I haven't really been able to muster up a spirit of celebration for the occasion. Sometimes I think too much celebrating gets in the way of the sort of story that I want to tell you tonight. When we appreciate that it was an open secret in 1920 that Black women's disenfranchisement was a presumption, a foundation of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that understanding, I think, fits awkwardly with events that feature laser light shows and period costumes and marching bands. The members of Congress who promulgated the 19th Amendment, the state lawmakers who ratified it, and the suffragists themselves all understood that nothing in the amendment's terms prohibited the states from strategically using poll taxes and literacy tests, understanding clauses to keep Black women from registering to vote. Nothing in the new amendment promised to curb the intimidation and violence that threatened Black women who came out to polling places. Voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand in 1920. Now, the good news, I suppose, is that I'm a historian and nothing in my job requires me to plan commemoration festivities. My work instead is to cut through the half-truths and the myths about the past and equip us with the critical tools we need to think about the future of our democracy. Some 25 years ago, historian Michel Rolfe-Triot looked back on the celebrations that marked 500 years since 1492. That was back in 1992. It was the year in which Christopher Columbus was said to have discovered the Americas. Triot warned historians away from that occasion. He was concerned that we would be drawn into promoting sanitized, partial truths and even myths that the occasion demanded. The difficult history of European contact and conquest with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, including that of Columbus, Triot was right, muted and even omitted altogether in efforts to cast that anniversary as a celebration. Such framings may have filled the coffers of tourist venues and souvenir sellers, but they did very little to promote critical understanding of how colonialism devastated the people and the lands of the hemisphere. So when I asked about why I have stayed home from celebrations, I note that the centennial of the 19th Amendment does indeed mark a milestone in the American story of voting rights. I add that remembering that era of voter suppression may also help us see more clearly how ballots are being withheld from Americans in our own time. It might even encourage us to recommit to the ongoing work of ensuring the voting rights of all Americans. And I'm eager to contribute the stories of Black women to our collective understandings of the 19th Amendment. But as a nation, we're not quite yet ready for that grand celebration. The promise of voting rights for all still, I think, regrettably remains out on the horizon. So let's look at August 1920, when the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution, and let's take on, I think, two of the most predominant myths. The first is that when the amendment became law, all American won the vote. We even sometimes hear that all American women were guaranteed the vote after the amendment was ratified. The second myth is one that is almost runs counter to the first, and that is that no Black American women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept all Black women from the polls. So let's replace those myths with history and recognize that voting rights in America have always been born of struggle, that the battles waged 100 years ago for a constitutional right and against Jim Crow still echo in 2020 as American women continue to work against voter suppression and for full access to the polls. So what happened in August 1920? The US Secretary of State certified that the 19th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified by the required 36 states. It took another week, but the amendment became the law of the land after Tennessee ratified. And let's just pause to look at the language of the Constitution now. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. What precisely did that mean then for American women? Surely now laws that reserved the ballot to men violated the Constitution. They no longer had the force of law. And still, the 19th Amendment did not promise American women the vote. Laws, state laws, still kept women from the polls based upon age, based upon citizenship and residency, based upon mental competence. It was still true in 1920 that American women who married foreign nationals, husbands who were not American citizens, were denaturalized and not only lost their citizenship, but lost the right to vote. So women who showed up to register in the fall of 1920 still confronted many hurdles, even if sex was not one of them. And of course, there was one additional barrier to women's votes that persisted even after a federal amendment, and those were barriers that emanated out of racism. Now, it was true that the 15th Amendment, which had been ratified in 1870, had expressly forbid the states from denying the vote to any man because of race. But by 1920, lawmakers in the South and West had set in place hurdles that, while silent on their face about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising Black male voters. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s. This, along with unchecked intimidation, the threat of lynching, sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line without ever expressly invoking race. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African American women in too many states became merely equals to their fathers and their husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around the spirit of the 19th and the 15th Amendments, that both. Registration numbers reflected the effect of discriminatory laws. In the fall of 1920, Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but many found the books closed. We can look at examples from across the nation, Kent County in Delaware, where Black women turned out only to be subjected to what were called constitutional tests. They were required to interpret a complex provision in the Constitution. I challenge any of us to interpret the Electoral College without a lot of study. But here, local officials use the Constitution and its complex provisions to keep Black women from the polls. In Huntsville, Alabama, only a half dozen Black women were among the nearly 1,500 who registered, and the explanation was clear. Officials applied practically the same rules of qualification to women that had been applied to men. In Savannah, Georgia, officials imposed the letter of the law and concluded that while Black women had turned out, they weren't entitled to vote because they hadn't been residents and registered for 6 months before the election. Now, how could they have? Registration opened in September and the election was in November. And this ruling meant that no women in the state of Georgia could vote, but it was an expressly racialized interpretation of the law, one intended to keep Black women from the polls. And still, at the same time, even before 1920, there are African American women who are exercising a right to vote. State governments had extended the franchise to women, importantly in states like California in 1911, Illinois in 1913, New York in 1917. And by 1920, in those places, Black women were already seasoned voters. They managed to cast ballots there in the fall of 1920 in the wake of the 19th Amendment, but they didn't need the amendment in order to do so. Now, Black women anticipate the challenges they're going to face at the polls. And in some localities, they importantly come together to organize suffrage schools. One example is from St. Louis, Missouri, where the women affiliated with that city's Black YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley branch, come together to teach one another how to register, how to pay a poll tax, how to pass a literacy tests. They even attract men who are also eager to vote. And in St. Louis, as in many jurisdictions, the stakes are high. St. Louis is in the early stages of imposing residential segregation. Those local ordinances are being approved by voters at the polls. And so Black women are determined to get registered in that city precisely because they want the opportunity not only to experience their own political power writ large, but because they are interested in combating the ongoing rise of Jim Crow segregation in their hometown. Now, if the women in St. Louis are largely successful, Black women come by the fall of 1920 to make up somewhere between 10 and 20% of the more than 110,000 new women voters who register in that season. There are other places where African American women face brutal opposition. In Daytona, Florida, for example, the educator and suffragist Mary McLeod Bethune has spent 1919 and 1920 registering African-American women to vote. Her school in Daytona, today's Bethune-Cookman University, on the eve of Election Day in the fall of 1920, will be visited by white-robed Ku Klux Klansmen who march onto the ground of Bethune's girls' school in an attempt to scare Black women and their allies away from the polls. They will turn out in important numbers the next day, and many of them will cast their ballots. But by 1922, the violence is relentless, and this extraordinary effort by Black women in Florida to become part of the body politic will be roundly defeated by Klan violence. So what to do? African-American women are organized nationally in what is as close to a suffrage association as any organization they will create. The National Association of Colored Women had been founded in 1895, had included suffrage on its agenda, but was as committed, for example, to defeating Klan violence and lynching. They had long lobbied for federal legislation that would curtail the violence that confronted Black voters at the polls and elsewhere. But in 1920, Hallie Quinn Brown, an educator, Black Methodist church activist, member of the NACW, has been elected president of the association. And she is charged with leading now hundreds of thousands of Black women into a new political moment, one in which the 19th Amendment is behind them, but the realization of voting rights is still out on the horizon. Hallie Quinn Brown concludes that what a next step is or will be for Black women is to win federal legislation, laws out of Congress that will give teeth to the 15th and the 19th Amendments and permit Black women to defeat on the state level the Jim Crow laws that are keeping them from the polls. Hallie Quinn Brown launches this strategy with an eye toward an alliance, and she will call on Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, one of the organizations rightly credited with a radical campaign that leads to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Alice Paul's National Women's Party convenes in the winter of 1921, and Hallie Quinn Brown goes out of her way to be there. This is the meeting that is going to mark and celebrate the 19th Amendment, and Hallie Quinn Brown is sure that African-American women need to be present. And at the same time, she appears with a delegation from the National Association of Colored Women, a delegation that looks to win Alice Paul and the National Women's Party as allies in this ongoing campaign for women's full enfranchisement. Hallie Quinn Brown will be disappointed. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party will fold up the organization in the winter of 1921, and Alice Paul will move on to a new campaign, still grounded in the program of women's rights. She will initiate in 1923 a campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment, a campaign that still persists until today. But she will leave, if you will, African-American women behind, leave them alone to build a new movement for voting rights, one that will take the form of litigation, led importantly by the NAACP as it chips away at the foundation of Jim Crow, including challenges to the limits placed upon voting rights by the individual states. That campaign will continue to include voter education and voter activism on the ground, Black American women who will continue each season to press for registration, to press to get to the polls. And they will be very much inspired by women in cities like Chicago, where Black women are able to use their force at the polls to tip the balance in local and state level elections, sending the first African-American man to Congress since 1901, for example, in 1928. There are powerful lessons that African-American women will use their strength at the polls, vote as a bloc to support Republican Party candidates, and on the state and local level, begin to exert real influence, to become voters of consequence. Even in the 1920s, this kind of work will continue to inspire Black women, even those who are disenfranchised. And of course, this road that begins in 1920 will continue until 1965, when finally Black women and men win that federal legislation that Hallie Quinn Brown had been calling for in 1920. The Voting Rights Act will be signed into law that year by President Lyndon Johnson after a grassroots, profoundly courageous campaign waged locally in many southern cities and towns across this country. African-American women like the great Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Diane Nash, Septima Clark, and others who will put not only their ideas to the test, not only insist on their principles, but put their bodies on the line in a campaign that will mean that neither Congress nor the president can resist the force of the claim for Black voting rights and the teeth of the Voting Rights Act. This is in many ways the culmination of a long campaign waged by African-American women. One of the ways in which Black women, I think, radically transform the story of the 19th Amendment is indeed by rendering it one stop, one episode in a much longer story of voting rights in this country. I'm someone who's resisted the term suffrage in relating a great deal of this history, because I want us to see the connections between the campaign for the 19th Amendment, the long road to the Voting Rights Act, and even until the struggles for voting rights in our own time. The 19th Amendment prohibited the states from denying the vote based upon sex, just as the 15th Amendment had forbid the states from using race when determining voting rights. And still, as we've visited tonight, many American women did not have the unqualified right to vote. As was true in 1920, where a woman lives, for example, the fact of that long history of residential segregation that was correlated to race still keeps many women from the polls today. Just as states used laws that were neutral on their face, that did not expressly deprive voters of a right to the polls by virtue of their race or their sex. Today, we have these facially neutral laws, voter ID laws, the shuttering of polling places, the purging of voter rolls, all conceal their intent to deprive voters of color in the United States from getting to the polls. We live under extraordinary conditions in 2020. The pandemic has given voting rights a new kind of urgency, and yet has imposed a set of conditions that will require voters, Black voters, but all voters in this country, perhaps to risk their health and their well-being to get to the polls. This history of the 19th Amendment is more than myth. I think it is a cautionary tale for where we sit today. And still, I think it would be unwise to suggest that nothing has changed in 100 years since the 19th Amendment. We appreciate, I think, the important degree to which African-American women, especially since 1965, have become a force in American politics. We could point to the Black American women today who continue to vote as a bloc to consolidate their political power and to tip the balance in critical contests. I'll mention the 2017 special election in the state of Alabama, where African-American women's votes put the Democratic candidate, Doug Jones, over the top in a tight contest. There, Black women used their voting power, used it as a bloc, and flipped that Senate seat from red to blue in a Senate where, as we are all witness to nearly each and every day, every vote counts when making and promoting legislation. I could point to the more than 120 African-American women who are running for Congress in 2020, coming up in just a few weeks. This is a record-shattering number of African-American women. The high bar had been 48 4 years ago. This year, more than 120 Black women vying for seats in Congress, I think conveys how far Black women have traveled in a very short time. I can't end without mentioning Senator Kamala Harris, of course, because Senator Harris has shattered another glass ceiling, if you will, for African-American women, joining Joe Biden on the Democratic Party's ticket. And perhaps some of you heard Senator Harris's acceptance speech just a few weeks ago during the Democratic National Convention. I sat up in my seat when she first credited her own mother and then name-checked 6 women, all of whom who appear in my most recent book, Vanguard, women who she explained we all stand on the shoulders of. Black suffragists like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, whose confrontation with the Ku Klux Klan we heard a bit about tonight, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, those extraordinary sheroes of the modern civil rights era, and Constance Baker Motley, a member of the NAACP's legal team that chipped away at the foundations of Jim Crow, Bring Us Brown versus Board of Education. Constance Baker Motley will go on to a remarkable public career as a federal judge for the balance of her public life. So here, as much as I am not someone to celebrate, I am not someone to tell us that there aren't things worth remarking upon and that aren't remarkable about 2020. I'll look forward to staying tuned with you all as we move through this election season and beyond. And I hope that the stories of Vanguard both help you to think critically about where we are, but also will inspire you to commit and recommit to voting rights in this country, much in the way that the women I write about did 100 years ago. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I believe I'm going to turn things back over to Professor Mannion, who will work with us on the question and answer. So thank you all very much.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. There's so much to talk about and unpack. And I would love to hear you tell us a little bit more about Alice Paul and Hallie Quinn Brown. and why it's important for us in 2020 to still grapple with and understand the significance of most white suffragists abandoning Black women. And what's the legacy of that for us now?
I take it that you all in the Amherst community, as in many of our communities, have been asking pointedly and deliberately, how did we get here in 2020? How is it that anti-Black racism has not only persisted as a set of attitudes or ideas, but seems to permeate so much of our public life, our institutional life? That, I think, is the question of this historical moment. And one answer to that, I think, lies in the way I would put it, the missed opportunity of the suffrage movement. That is to say, that at every moment in the long road to the 19th Amendment, African American women are present, are engaged, are amenable, if not available, to working in alliance with white American suffrage leaders. What they are not willing to do is to work in sustained community with organizations and with figures who themselves are trading in anti-Black racism. But I can't help but have the sense that Alice Paul misses an opportunity to, if you will, invest in and contribute to the interests of all humanity by staying in the voting rights struggle with African American women. There are some pragmatic dimensions to that. Paul is a brilliant strategist, a political strategist, and certainly it would be fascinating to imagine her alliance with African American women and how she would approach the struggles around Jim Crow. But she steps away. And to my mind, it really is that sort of missed opportunity that speaks to the limited political vision that many suffragists work through, which was the sense that somehow questions of race or color or racism were questions for another movement, a different movement, for civil rights circles, and that weren't a women's issue. And I don't know how that sounds to your 21st century ear, but it rings very discordant to me to imagine that we don't understand how racism is a women's issue. But in fact, I think that's the position that Paul takes. And I think that we live with the legacy of that, even in some of our best feminist thinking, that somehow racism is a civil rights issue to be managed in other quarters, and that women deal with women's issues. Of course, for someone who studies Black women, those things are impossible to pull apart.
Thank you. You know, I think this ties into that. You mentioned in your talk and in the book about Black women's collective power and how they mobilize that and use that in so many ways. And I want to draw us back to an op-ed you wrote this summer called "Black Women in Politics Are No Longer a First, They're a Force." And you cited that statistic that came out of the 2016 presidential election. 94% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton, while white women split between Clinton and Trump. And I just wonder if you could, with your, both historians and, cultural critic, lawyerly hats, unpack that for us a bit.
Sure. In the immediate lead up to the 19th Amendment, the premise that all the major proponents and some of the antagonists trade in is the promise that the amendment will not enfranchise African American women, especially in the South. And we might just ascribe that to kind of general anti-Black animus, racism. But there's more to it. There's a lot of speculation about will women vote and how will they vote after a federal amendment. And generally, white women are expected not to turn out in large numbers, but those that do turn out are expected to vote just like their husbands and their fathers. It's an awfully sexist, right, sort of projection. But that is to say that white women are not expected to shift the balance of power between political parties because they will split. And indeed they do. And so, anti-suffragists will say women's votes are just simply duplicative of men's votes, right? They won't make a difference in the outcomes. But African-American women, everybody expects, and actually everybody knows from the examples of New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco, everybody knows that African-American women are highly likely to vote as a bloc and in 1920 support the Republican Party. It's the old Republican Party. Folks know there is a major party shift that follows on the 19th Amendment. But they are expected to, and this is what really leads white Democrats to, once the 19th Amendment has been ratified, to get behind women's votes and campaign to get white women to the polls, because the fear is that Black women will get to the polls and they will begin to shift the balance of power and shift the outcome in elections, especially on the local level and to some degree on the state level. So nobody's expecting Black women quite yet to shift a presidential contest outcome, but it is very likely that Black women can determine who might be mayor or alderman, who might sit in a state legislature or be the local constable or justice of the peace. That is possible even in 1920. So this is to say that this is an old story. What we see in 2016 is an old story about African-American women who deliberate and organize collectively as Black women and develop. And this is partly the work of historian Liette Gidlow, who says women do vote as a bloc in the United States, but it's African-American women who do. And still 100 years later, we see that pattern evidenced in 2016 with white women voting a set of interests that are not contained by or consolidated around their identities as women, but voting many other kinds of interests, African-American women working by way of a long-standing and carefully honed political identity that permits them to come out in those numbers and us to anticipate that they will.
Mm-hmm. Your explanation of just the tremendous range of ways Black women were enfranchised or not enfranchised around, the 19th Amendment by location and class and all these things has inspired a question, I think, about the implications for that right now. And so someone wrote in and is wondering if you could talk to us about how women around the country can help to ensure that Black women in, quote, difficult counties can actually get to vote.
So I love the question, but if I could, I'm gonna just turn it a bit, because I think actually where we are right now is that African-American women are the model for how to get out the vote. What we know about Black women is that they not only vote as a bloc, their turnout is disproportionate to that of other Americans. And so when folks ask me sort of what are the lessons for our immediate moment, I would say tune in to the African American women's political organizations, civic organizations, churches, YWCAs, and more, and study up on how it is that they are organizing for November. Study up on how they are organizing around the challenges of the coronavirus, where a lot of our get out the vote on the ground tactics are going to be constrained by the virus conditions. Rather than worrying about how to get Black women to the polls, I would say study Black women so that other communities can adopt their strategies and approaches to getting out the vote, because that is the story of Alabama in 2017, that Black women work out of the very same sorts of organizations that they were working in 100 years ago in 1920, out of the church basement, out of the YWCA hall, in sororities, in clubs and more. That's precisely what's going on as we sit here having this conversation. And I hope you have a chance to tune in your own community to learn some of their tactics and strategies, because they have proven to be powerfully effective.
Thank you. I have two related questions about voter suppression. To the extent to which you'd like to speak to this issue. One is, what role do you think that this year's census and its potential manipulation will be playing in relation to voter suppression? And then also, could you share with us your take on some of the most egregious forms of voter suppression that are currently happening?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question about the relationship between the census and voter suppression. My understanding, is that there's a great deal to be concerned about, because the census response rates have been very low. Perhaps understandably, given the complexity of our conditions. But what is the census for? Why do we conduct a census? The census data gets used for many things. Social scientists love the census data and extrapolate many things from it. But its purpose is in apportioning representatives and allocate to Congress, and then allocating federal resources back from Washington to states and localities. So we will feel the effects of census undercount in some communities for a very long time, for a decade or more. And so I think this is one piece. What I don't think we learned in the census experience was how to overcome the logistics, right, of what it means to engage in sort of a national communal enterprise like census enumeration or voting. And so I don't think there's a lot of wisdom coming out of the census that is fueling the best thinking on how now to deal with the vote. But we will feel the consequence of the census enumeration, unfortunately, for a very long time in those communities where Americans have been grossly under counted. The second question is about the worst of voter suppression. That's difficult to say. I'm not sure, which is to say, I think it's all sort of the sum total of the worst. But, there's a way in which, whether it's a voter ID requirement, or it's an exact match requirement when you get to the polls. I think these moments when voters who personally, individually present themselves to voting officials and are turned down and are turned away and are refused the opportunity to cast a ballot. These sorts of scenes, I think, have stay with voters a very long time and contribute to voter suppression far out beyond the occasion of any given election, right? Whether your feeling is anger at being denied the opportunity to cast your ballot, or frustration, or it might even be embarrassment or humiliation. You've somehow been publicly branded illegitimate or not entitled. I think those kinds of encounters with officials are have long-term implications for voting. Now, I did see at least one news report that came out of Virginia this week as voters there began early voting in person. And adjacent to the polling place, in the report I saw, were protesters whose presence and exuberance and more, it was suggested, was functioning to impose fear on voters, right? And that is very reminiscent of 1920, that Black American women, when they do vote in many localities in 1920, turn out in numbers, hoping that is a strategy for resisting the same kind of intimidation that surrounds polling places in 1920. Even shy of violence, though violence is also a factor, even shy of violence, you know, the prospect of a mob, of jeering, of epithets and more. We can see in the newspapers from 1920 how Black women were harassed when they arrived at a polling place, when they waited in line. And so that in Virginia, to my mind, is a level of voter intimidation, not just suppression, right? Voter intimidation, that once again, we know the ways in which violence and the prospect of violence keeps people away from the polls for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. So I want to shift gears a little bit back to history and your take on it. I think one of the themes that unites your scholarship is the claim that Black women have built, shaped, defined, and improved American democracy for centuries, right? In all different kinds of ways, whether or not they had formal political power. You refuse to have their advocacy reduced to a single issue, such as suffrage, although you wouldn't know it by our conversation tonight. You follow the women where they gathered, right, into churches especially, rather than bemoaning their absence from other spaces that are traditionally deemed political. And I would love to hear how you got there. What are the life experiences, the books, the archives, like what opened this window for you early on to take this approach to the past?
I think many readers are surprised that Vanguard begins not with women in politics, but in part it begins with women in church. That seems, I think, to many readers like a somewhat unorthodox way to begin a history of women in the vote. But there are a couple of things that came out of that, but I'll start by saying this goes all the way back to my very first year in graduate school, when I was rooting around for a topic that would let me think about Black women, public life broadly, and power, and the struggles around that in early America. And I came across a very rather obscure microfiche collection. See, I did that on purpose because I'm thinking, if you know what microfiche is, you're either really old like me or you're really like a hardcore history major. But microfiche was the sort of celluloid cards that you used in an awkward reader back in the day. And I found this souvenir program from a church conference on microfiche. And there was an illustration, a sort of composite set of portraits of luminaries. And one of them was someone named Reverend Mrs. Mary Small. And I said, Reverend Mrs. It's usually the opposite. It's Mrs. Reverend or something. You know, it was inverted. And I thought, what is a woman minister doing here? It's 1905 or something. And I started to pull that thread, as we do, and discover that in Black Methodist churches, there had been, by the beginning of the 20th century, nearly 100 years of debate about women and power and authority that was very much couched in terms of women's rights. So I returned to that in this book. And part of what I'm searching for are women activists and looking for Black women in the places where they develop their sense of politics and power, where they wrestle with men over authority and office holding and voting. All of that happens in the church. But also what I'm interested in is ideas. And I'm really interested in how Black women develop in the 19th century a political philosophy, a critique that says, you know, the ideal in American politics is a culture that is devoid of racism and devoid of sexism. And for most of our history, Black women are alone in holding that up and insisting on that as an ideal. And it turns out that one of the origins of those ideas is with Black church women, including Black women preachers who I write about, who in order to overcome the sexism in their church, have to read the Bible and study the women in it and develop a sense of history and politics and a political theory that will, on a good day, carry the day and get them things like preaching licenses, and later for Mary Small ordained to the ministry. But it all starts in that microfiche, is what I want to say. That I'm the kind of historian who really kind of believes in the archive, and the more obscure, the better. And I'm very indebted to Mary Small, who does make an appearance in Vanguard. I'm very happy to be able to lift her up a bit because she really was somebody who just changed my thinking on a dime.
Wonderful. So I think I have one last question.
Sure.
I would be remiss if I did not ask your insights on the White House Conference on American History. I'm just going to read one line that President Trump said. He said, "The left has warped, distorted, and defiled the American story with deceptions, falsehoods, and lies. There's no better example than the New York Times totally discredited 1619 project. This project rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom," end quote. And I, wonder if you could speak to that remark and reflect on why histories of slavery and the African-American experience are being challenged in this way.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Jen Mannion. Because I want to keep my remarks short and in bounds. But I will say that I think first thing to say is that probably we shouldn't be terribly surprised that in a moment as fraught as this one, that history becomes sort of one of the battlegrounds that we where we are waging these. This is not the first time historians have been in the crosshairs of difficult politics and more. And that is because, I think, because the stakes are high in our nation, rests on many sorts of pillars, but one of them is a set of stories about who we are and what our origins are and how we got from here to there. That's not unique to the United States, but it's essential to the United States. And I do think it's stunning that the White House would imagine that this is somehow a new turn or somehow a revelation, regarding this is a revelation about what historians have been saying for a very long time. I think as long as you and I certainly have been historians, there's been no question, but that the intertwined story of American slavery and American freedom is a pretty stock narrative, not a provocative one, not a new or novel one, especially. So the 1619 Project, which enjoys a different sort of platform than our books do, I think it's fair to say, right, elevates a great deal of that work, that thinking, to a broader audience and perhaps a more, a politically more plugged in audience than our books sometimes do. And yet I just don't think there's anything in the 1619 Project, which is vast and multifaceted, and has generated extraordinarily interesting and important debate. I don't think there's anything in it that is a surprise to us as historians, even if we might quibble, right, about the fine points. So here we are. And, the last thing I'll say is, I don't know if this is true for you, but it's true for me that, you can be a historian, especially a historian of early America, and lament that you work too much of the time in relative obscurity, that we do the good, great work of the archives and the articles and the monographs, and it oftentimes feels like a conversation we have with one another. Well, here, I think as historians, we have a remarkable opportunity to be part of the conversation in this critical moment. So I wouldn't have wished this upon us or our field, but I do take it to be an opportunity for us to weigh in immediately and meaningfully. And so I'm deeply admiring of those of us who have taken the challenge of the White House conference and the president's remarks. I read Ed Ayers, for example, today, on reminding Americans what history is, how it works, and what we know and how we know it. It's an opportunity for us, even though it comes at a politically very difficult time.
No, I just appreciate your thoughtful answers. And I ask just because I know you are so committed to connecting those dots between our very archivally anchored, serious historical monographs and a general readership. And you're one of the scholars that I admire for doing that so effectively without allowing the integrity of your historical work to be compromised. So it's just been a great honor to talk with you, and much appreciation for all of your scholarship. And I'm going to turn it back over to Provost Epstein.
Well, thank you, Professors Jones and Mannion, for that wonderful conversation. I think what moved me most was, again, the strength of Black women activists and all that they have done for the country. And, you really described that nicely with how they expanded the vote and how they sort of worked against voter suppression. So I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. Before closing, I just want to give a few reminders. So if you are a seminar participant, remember to sign up for a discussion section. And meanwhile, I want to thank everyone in the audience tonight for joining us for this important conversation. And I want to remind you that the third of our lectures in this series will be held on Wednesday, October 14th at 7 p.m. And it will feature Khalil Gibran Muhammad speaking about the condemnation of Blackness. So thanks again to Professor Jones and Professor Mannion, and everyone have a great evening and good night.